Dear Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. I'm grateful yet again for the opportunity to teach, but first of all to have learned and continue to do so. And thank you for what you have given to us through Jesus, who is the greatest gift, the grace that we have been given. And in this we revel today as we speak about the gratitude that we have not only for our work, but for the work that you have done for us in Jesus. Amen. This week, there might have been a couple of extra letters. I just wanted to mention this because of the Comenius Institute. There were a few left. I put them on the back. Maybe some of you already grabbed those. They were leftovers from patron letters that I send out for Comenius. So I thought if you grabbed one, you could at least see some of the work that we do on the campus at IUPUI. So we continue the process of thinking through vocation from a distinctively biblical point of view. And of course, this has been our focal point all the way through, that our abilities, our work, our job, everything comes from him, and therefore we ought to give thanks for those things that have been given. And hence, since this is Thanksgiving weekend, perhaps it's important for us to consider gratitude for our work. Gratitude for our work. So to lead up to this, let's take a look at what makes people happy, what some people give thanks for. This is a brand new graph, just came out this month, November. And this is what different age groups believe they need to be happy. So they're saying, money would make me happy if I had this much. You'll notice that the millennials way at the bottom there are the ones that require the most. So they require 1.7 million. Now, I'm assuming, because the graph and the explanation for it didn't really say, I'm assuming that this is money that you have in hand at any given moment. So the millennial says, you know, if I had 1.7 million in hand at any given moment, then I would be happy, and this would provide happiness for me. Notice where the boomers lie. We only need 1 million, I guess, according to this 999. And then women need less. Men need more, it seems. But look who's leading the pack, who needs the least amount of money. It's Gen Z. All of the people that I'm teaching in my classes right now, it seems they need the less amount of money. I was fascinated by this. So when we think about the issue of gratitude for the things that we should be happy for, some people still are considering the issue of wealth as important to them. Now, this just came across my digital files this last week, and I was just shocked by this. For those of you who may not have been following the news since October 7th, there was a horrendous, what I've been calling a Holocaustic horror that took place in Israel on October 7th. Well, I won't go into the details of that, except to say that Cornell University, which is the focal point of this particular slide, seemed to have a great influx, shall we say, of anti-Semitism on campus, which has been happening on numerous campuses around the United States, as well as in large cities around the world. Well, it seems then that donors stepped in and said, look, if you don't take care of this, then we're going to stop giving to your university. And isn't it amazing how immediately people respond to the problem of money? And so the president of Cornell said, well, let's take stock of this issue. And November 3rd, as I recall from the article, Cornell University decided that they would go back to religious tradition in the Jewish tradition to find some respite, to find some place where they could kind of say, look, we gave honor to the Jewish populace here. And this quote that I have on the left-hand side of the slide is the subtitle underneath that big title at the top, Cornell's Secular Sabbath, 10 square miles surrounded by the rest of the world. I just thought that was a hilarious title because, you know, academics have this idea that somehow they're just wholly different from everybody else, you know, and better sometimes than everybody else. And so I just snickered at that. I couldn't help myself. Now, the subtitle, which is really, really small, you can't read it, but I put it up in big, bold print here. How the Secular University, in a time of crisis, sorry, it just makes me giggle, man. This is coming from Cornell, so this whole thing is from Cornell University. In a time of crisis, well, what's the real crisis? The crisis is patrons are going to leave and quit giving money to this if you all don't quit your anti-Semitism. Fell back on religious tradition. So where did they go? The whole article, by the way, both of these articles on the money slide, last slide, and this slide are in the handout on the back. You can actually go there and check these things out. They go back to the Pentateuch. Amazing, isn't it? How the first 5 books of the Bible just give us the foundation for all things. And so here you have this emphasis on Cornell University finding respite in Mosaic teaching. Now, of course, the last 2 sessions we've have been on rest, so it's interesting to me that Cornell would address this as a secular Sabbath, which is just absolutely antithetical, as we know from this slide. I've been using every single week for a reason, and that is because everything is sacred. There's no such thing as secular anything. If God made it, He sustains it, He's going to culminate it, He's going to restore it. This is it. Everything is sacred. So, to that point also, so is thanksgiving. So is gratitude, which is where we are going here today. And it strikes me then that we should perhaps do a bit of a history lesson on gratitude. And let's go back to some of the ancients, such as Epictetus, a Greek philosopher, said, "He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things he has not, but rejoices for those which he has." Now, because I was just finishing up my PowerPoint presentation during the time my grandchildren were here over the last few days, I have to tell you that my grandson, who was concerned about the number of fruit snack packages that he had, at the time, he said, Saba, I've only got one. And so my response to him was something along the line of Epictetus, and I said to him, better to have one and wish for 2 than to have none at all. Which, of course, was the point of, if you don't quit complaining about this, you know where that goes. So, better to have one and wish for 2 than to have none at all. I mean, Epictetus in 2023 with fruit snacks. I mean, how much more application do you need? And then, of course, there's Cicero, one of the great Roman historians. Gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but the parent of all others. And it interests me to tell you this, that in some of my teaching, this was a student who knew of my Christian theological stance. We had had discussions, actually just this semester. And he said, interrupted me in class one day, and he said, what you're saying right now sounds very Stoic. Now, the Stoics were basically people who believed in reason. They also believed in self-control and fortitude, but basically everything coming out of reason. And I smiled at him. This is in class. I smiled at him and I said, look, man, the Stoics got all their good stuff from Moses in the Hebrew Bible. So we always go back to First Testament teaching because it's all right there. But this, of course, the issue of gratitude and the emphasis on virtue is hugely important for us. And, of course, not to be outdone, we need to just look back briefly at Christian history, the famous and important Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said, in an ordinary life, we hardly realize that we receive a great deal more than we give, and that it is only with gratitude that life becomes rich. Now, just by the way, I'm about to show you or tell you a story through slides in a moment. But if you have not seen or do not have a copy of William Bennett's book, The Book of Virtues, you could probably find one online for about 99 cents. It'll cost you more to have it shipped to you than it will to actually purchase the thing. But make sure to get a hardbound copy of Bill Bennett's book, The Book of Virtues, because in it he takes 10 of the major virtues and he tells stories from ancient history to modern, and from cultures across the globe. It's really fascinating stuff, and I highly recommend it. So the slides that I'm about to show you, a very famous story in its own right, come from that book, and I wanted to make sure to mention his name in that book to you. So, Androcles and the Lion. Androcles, a young Roman slave, sought escape in the wilderness from his unhappy life. He was a slave, of course. Finding respite in a cave, he found himself face to face with a lion. The beast was anxious only for the removal of a thorn from his paw. Upon its extraction by Androcles, the lion submitted to the man caring for him. After being captured as a runaway sometime later, Androcles was sentenced to death by mauling within the Colosseum. However, the lion let loose upon Androcles was one and the same who had benefited from the slave's earlier kindness. Instead of attacking the defenseless man, the lion lay at his feet, whereupon both were released by an astounded Roman governor. Yeah, I mean, what more can you do in a situation like that? But here it is, the issue of gratitude. And that little story by itself has so much virtue to it, so much credibility to it, and one that I think should be promoted and rehearsed and repeated to those around us. I think those kinds of stories are helpful and good. Along with this, Peggy Noonan, an essayist I followed for some time, said this about one of the folks who came here in legal immigration. This particular person said, "This is the place I came from, a place I would have been jailed for my point of view, or the fact that I could come to the United States and vote, and so on." But I have to tell you, while you read the slide, I have to tell you this, that I get a lot of student papers that I get to interact with. And one student paper this particular semester was talking about how bad the United States of America is. And so Mark, being Mark, wrote a long response to the person's paper and said, in essence, you think that this country is bad, then I find it fascinating that millions of people want to move here. Millions of people want to move here. Now, what I didn't say, what I wanted to say was, so, if it's really that bad, go check out some other country and take a look at those. And isn't it interesting that all the people that are protesting and, they want to go someplace else, man. Check it out. I want to get into other things there and say a few other comments, but I'll save those for personal conversations. Here's another slide. This is Roger Scruton, who unfortunately passed this last year, a famous writer. This is what he's emphasized. I've underlined the passage here. When government programs take over meeting the needs of people, that gifts are replaced by rights, so is gratitude replaced by claims, and claims breed resentment. In another paper this semester, where the person is emphasizing the idea that government will solve our problems, I emphasized this point. I said, if government gives something, it can also take it away. So one of the big issues, of course, is human rights. And so when anybody ever writes about human rights, I always respond, where did these rights come from? Well, in this particular case, this particular individual student said human rights come from government. And my response is, man, if human rights come from government, that's a precarious situation, I'd say, in the least, because government can take those rights right away. Now, this has application in various venues, especially in the financial venue, I might be quick to add here. But I think it's important for us to recognize this kind of comment about gratitude and thankfulness, that once we stop thinking about giving as an individual responsibility and hand it over to somebody else, we have now established the issue of claims on our giving. And it's the worst place to be in, just generally speaking. So, we also need to be humorous, don't we? One of my favorite comedians, Louis C.K., his response to the unappreciative, New York to LA takes 5 hours by plane. It used to take 30 years. By the time you got to California, you were with a whole new group of people. Of course, this is all tongue-in-cheek. Complaints about air travel. You hear people say in a whiny voice, I had to wait 20 minutes to board the plane. Oh, really? You're sitting in a chair in the sky. You are flying through the air. I love those lines. He goes on later on to say, for those who are complaining about Wi-Fi taking too long to get to their phone, it's going to space. Give it a second, he says. Louis C.K., man. Great stuff. And of course, you know, we have to mention a movie, don't we? Yes, we do. So, the movie here is The Game, and this is a review that I wrote a long time ago, whenever it came out. You can go to one of my websites, warpandwoof.org, and find it there. This is about a man who had everything, but he was an ingrate. And he's very much like Scrooge, who we'll also say a word or two about here today. And the problem, of course, is that he wanted everything, and he had everything, but he was still ungrateful. And because of that, he didn't appreciate not only the fact that he had all this stuff, but he didn't appreciate relationships and people and the things that mattered most. And he gets his comeuppance, of course. And this is what I wrote about this. We are dragged through a world impossible to predict. Crisis upon catastrophe is piled high. Every fright is replaced by another horror. Just when we think the character can take no more, the tension is ratcheted up yet another notch. Our initial revulsion of Nicholas Van Orton is upended at the end as we see him broken, uttering the phrase "thank you" for the very first time at the end of the movie. And then, if we are sensitive to the story, we no longer see actors, but we see ourselves. When was the last time that we took for granted that which we are, who we are, and what we have, and wanting for more or to get over on the next person and all of the rest? So I've put this in a whole list of problematic issues. How often do we bellyache about the slightest of grievances? Let's start with the one that Mark struggles with all the time going into the city to go teach. When I get cut off on the highway, it's probably best we don't pursue that, very far. But let's just say it makes Mark unhappy. For those of you who are watching later on, I'm Mark, okay? This is being taped. So was anybody inconsiderate at the checkout line? Do I have to say my constant appeal to people? Leave your checkbook at home. Do not write a check at the end when all the food is, there's nothing so unnerving as that. Did a person not meet our slightest expectation? Oh my. Here's another one that, this is me all through and through. What small inconvenience has intruded upon my life today? Oh man, I could make a list. I did. Look, a light bulb has gone out. The printer's run out of ink. Did we get a paper cut? Were we let down because the product was out of stock? Was our latte not made to our liking? I mean, these are the great grievances of our age, are they not? And taking them a little further, are we a generation of whiners? Okay, that's spelled with an H, all right? There might be some other issues there, but this one's spelled with an H. Are we ever pleased about anything without qualifying with a complaint? The famous, all of this is good, but, we hear the but coming at the end, don't we? Do small disappointments ignite our ingratitude? And have we become Scrooge, and I've put here in brackets, or Mr. Wilson? So at my house, between Robin and I will say something like, Mr. Wilson popped out again today as I was coming home. One of the things, I'll just tell you one thing. One of the things that really gets me is when people have these huge driveways and 2- and 3-car garages and they park their cars in the street. Oh, man. Oh, man. You're getting close to seeing some of the true nature of the guy that's teaching here today. But all of this is true. Just talk to Robin afterwards. All right. Now, I've been using this diagram forever and a day, for years and years, I think 30 plus years, I think, and you can fill in the blanks here if you're so inclined. I noticed that I didn't do that for you. My humblest apologies, but here's your opportunity for paper and pencil. So, 2 pillars of life. Here's life, and here's one pillar for life. One of them is discipline, which means that we accept responsibility for what has been given coming from ourselves. So, If something's been given to me, now I require the appropriate discipline to utilize it properly. But the other pillar of life is gratitude, and that suggests that we acknowledge something coming from outside of ourselves. So do we bear responsibility from within ourselves? Yes, of course we do. But we also acknowledge someone or something coming from outside, and we ought to be thankful for that. That's the whole focal point of our teaching here this morning, is on gratitude and the necessity of seeing it and appropriating it and then actually applying it in real life. So, two pillars of life, discipline and gratitude. One comes from within and one comes from without. Now let's talk about some of those and give some examples, and then we'll get to the text of Scripture and highlight how this actually works out for us. So gratitude begins outside of ourselves. To be thankful is to acknowledge someone outside. What we need is a confession, which is, by the way, the Hebrew word for thanks. So when the Hebrews said thank you, they were confessing. Well, what's confession? It's not the idea of going to the confessional to ask forgiveness for sin or going to confess something in a court of law. It is indeed a declaration of God's greatness. So when people were talking about giving thanks, they were declaring the greatness of God. So from a Hebraic point of view, First Testament point of view, this is what this is all about. So once we see this, then, we acknowledge that confession is thanksgiving. It's an exaltation, praise, or glorification, remembering God and His work. Our confession is to be made among the nations in large assemblies of people with song. Gee, sounds very vaguely familiar, like what we do here. Confessional praise was wholehearted with a right mind continually. That's why the necessity of the shift that needs to take place in our mindset. And indeed, Jesus came from Judah's line. Judah, literally, his name meant to confess. Now, on the back of the handout today is all of that stuff. And there's other stuff back here. But basically, what I've done here is I've given you a short course on thankfulness. It's on the back of the handout. And I've given you all of the quotation marks, as a good professor might do, trying my hardest here. I've given you all of the footnotes. And two of the footnotes from the earlier slides about money and Cornell University are also in here. So you can check this out. I won't insult your intelligence by reading all of this. But my point and emphasis is that confession literally should be, is, in Hebraic fashion, a thanksgiving. So, if all of life is a gift of God, and think of Mark's favorite book on Scripture, which is Ecclesiastes, that's the point of Ecclesiastes, our whole focus then needs to be about this. And our appreciation then comes from worship. Now, my definition of worship is the total response of the total person to our Lord Jesus Christ. Notice the words there, total, total. The total response of the total person. So my whole response, which, by the way, is not always good, and as I've already suggested in some earlier slides, and I'm not always appreciative. So basically, when I'm teaching, I'm basically teaching to myself. Y'all are just kind of standing by over here and you listening in. So this appreciation ought to come through our worship, but worship ought to be everything that we do, all of our response. So our love for God literally comes into play when we are demonstrating our love for others. Hence the famous commandment that you love God and love others. And that's the essence of what it means to be a believer. Back to Androcles, what is the idea that comes out of First Testament teaching and the virtues of Roman and Greek and Hebrew understanding? We first look up, then it changes us within, and then we give out. So up, within, and out. That's our response to gratitude and how that actually should play out in our life. Now, we're going to do a little bit of original language study here today, only I'm going to put it in English so we can all get it. But my point and emphasis, and by the way, these are all on your page, all kind of written out here. My point of emphasis is the importance of the original language. Now, I'll just pause here for just a slight sidebar. When you look at theological seminaries or colleges, Bible colleges, and you see people beginning to take out the study of original languages, of Hebrew and Greek, you can immediately know that that's going to become a slide down toward what J. Gresham Machen would have called liberalism, and what we would call today progressivism. Once you lose the original, once you lose the study of the original language, now theology is left up to the professor. And that is a scary proposition. So you need an original. You need to go back to the original. You need to at least appreciate Hebrew and Greek. Doesn't mean you have to study it. Just means that this is important for a foundation laid for anybody who's teaching Scripture. So there's my sidebar about the original language and the importance of it. Here is an example of it. So when we talk about God's grace, and we talk about this within the concept of thanksgiving, notice what we are given here. This all comes out of 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, which, by the way, are two of the most important chapters about giving in the Bible. God's grace is charis, that's the word in Greek, results in our thanksgiving, Eucharistia, that's the word in Greek, and then motivating us to gift giving. This is charisma, which is most often used by our Pentecostal friends as it relates to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So you see the connection, right? Charis, Eucharistia, and charisma. All of those words then have that basic foundation of the word grace, and this is what we are after when we think about thanksgiving. So the next slide gives us this suggestion, and we have this again on the handout so you don't have to repeat it or emphasize it. There is grace to grace to grace that comes all the way from chapter 8 and verse 1 all the way to the end of chapter 9 and verse 15. And what is the emphasis? Grace to grace. What are the phrases? It begins with the grace of God and ends with grace or thanks be to God. And that final line, if you haven't read 2 Corinthians 9 lately, that final line in chapter 9 and verse 15 of 2 Corinthians says, "And thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift." And guess who that is? Notice I said who, which ought to give a hint, which is Jesus, of course. And so when we think about the grace of God, this thing that has not anything to do with us, remember what I said about gratitude and our emphasis on someone, something outside of us? This someone, something outside of us who has given us grace, this charis, leads us to give thanks, which then leads us to give. So the reason why we are giving during Thanksgiving is because giving has been given to us. So, just to make a point of it, this literally, and what I suggest here, grace literally litters, I chose that word specifically, litters the chapters and so many other words for giving. So here they are. The grace of God, grace equals joy, grace equals favor. It's an act of grace. Grace of Christ, grace equals thanks. So, and also this concept of being a gift given to us. Again, all of this is on your handout, so you don't have to repeat anything here. And then, yet again, in chapter 9, grace is a gift. It's a bounty. We give confession for it. This grace giver is hilarious. You remember the famous line, right? That the best giver is one who gives lavishly or with excitement or with laughter. So happy they can give, which is a really important idea. Grace is also communion, Eucharist. So whenever we celebrate communion here once a month in most churches, when we celebrate communion as Eucharist, we are giving thanks for what has been done on our behalf. It's not something that we are doing to just go through a process or go through steps just to do it because we've been commanded to do it. No, it's supposed to be an expression of thanks, the essence of what it means to be before the Lord's Supper. And then, of course, that famous line I just quoted in 9:15, this inexpressible gift is, of course, the gift of Jesus himself. Now, how do we give out? Maybe you've seen some of these stories about these exorbitant gratuities that people give. Here's just an example of one. You know, you pay $80 for a dinner and you give $3,000 for a tip. I mean, wouldn't you like to be on the receiving end of that tip? Well, this has been practiced in lots of different places. But the whole point of it is that you give in excess. You're thankful for the service given by the server, which is a big deal. It reminds me of another paper that was done for my class, which actually won an award this last year, where the individual's paper was all about tipping and about giving and about how servers don't really get that much as a wage, but they depend on the gifts or the tips that come in. And it was really a great paper. I learned a lot about what it means to serve in a restaurant and how important it is to the person who's doing the service. All right. So we know at least a snapshot of what this gift giving might be and our giving to somebody else because of it. But I'm going to give you another little diagram that I've been using again for ages, it seems. And that is what I think ethics courses should be built on. Now I'm going to give you another little sidebar here for anybody who's interested at all in academics. If you know anything at all about academics, you know that generally speaking in the senior year, they have these courses called a capstone course. It's supposed to be the thing that is the penultimate, the ultimate course that kind of ties everything all together. And whenever I've been in academic situations, I always argue that the capstone is really insufficient because you really need a cornerstone course. I think when you start as freshmen, if you don't get freshmen invested in what they're there for, that is, for their particular interest area, what they want to major in, if you don't start them in the freshman year, man, these kids are going to drop out. If they got to wait until junior and senior year to take the courses that are in the major that I want to take in, come on, man. You got to start that thing early on. You got to start in the first semester, the first courses that they take. All right. My little pontification about academics. You're getting all kinds of little pontifications this morning. Aren't you happy that you came today? So first of all, I gave you the twin pillars of life. Now I'm going to give you the two foundation stones. So the first foundation stone has to do with ethics. And of course, if you've been in my teaching at all in the past, you know that this is a big deal to me. Ethics says, what should I do? And anytime you use the word should, you are automatically subscribing to some kind of ethical system. Whatever system it is you subscribe to, should indicates that you're there. Which, by the way, makes me also think that science can't do this. That's the reason why we have science and humanities. The sciences deal with quantitative research, very important for the Hubble telescope. Actually, the people that do the should stuff are us in the humanities, because we care about human beings and how people ought to act. There's the ought, the should, all of that kind of stuff. Science can't answer that question. I was in the airport. I think I showed this slide some time back in some other teaching I was doing here. And I was leaving the airport, and there was this big sign that said, we at such and such university in the science department give hope. And it was talking about they're celebrating the kinds of things that they do that are beneficial to help people recover from disease or illness. I took a picture of this, and while I'm there, I'm actually talking to the wall. I mean, who talks to the wall but Mark? I'm talking to the wall going, you don't give hope. Science doesn't give hope. Hope isn't in your venue. Science doesn't have courses on hope. No, that's a humanities issue. People looking at you, you know, and they're just want to leave the airport and get away from this guy. So, the whole point to ethics, where does the should come from? It's got to have an eternal source. If it doesn't have an eternal source, if you're depending on a temporal source, an earthbound human source, it's kind of like the government. They can give you whatever and take away whatever. But if it comes from God, it can never be taken away. hence the Declaration of Independence, saying that we had inalienable rights. See, whenever I say stuff like this, I'm thinking about 20 other things I'd like to say, but we don't have time. Let's go back to Louis C.K. because he probably says it best, that we should take nothing for granted. So years ago, I started this phrase, providential good fortune. Even Christians, I hear them use this word luck. To me, that's the L word. So when I think about luck, is no person. It has no power. It has no place. It doesn't exist. So we had to change this and give it a different phrase so that people could say something in response. This is providential good fortune. Providence indicates that there's a response to one above us. And being grateful for what we have. Once again, this semester, I was showing a segment of a documentary, and it had to do with clean water. I won't go into the background of why we were watching this little 5-minute piece, but it was all about clean water. And I stopped and I said to the students, do you know how long we've had clean water? I mean, that you could turn on the tap in the restroom over here and be able to drink that water. Do you know how long that's been? And of course, they have no clue. 18-year-olds generally think that the world started when they were born. You know how that is. So we've only had clean water for about 100 years. And that's not always been consistent, by the way. And then I said, because there's all kinds of students holding these bottles of water, I said, you know how long we've had those? Where you can go and get a bottled water? Only since the late 1970s. So they're all sitting there like, this just mystifies them because they can't believe that people haven't always had these things. And I say to them, see how much you have to be grateful for. I mean, these are things that you now have that nobody has had before. Isn't that cool? Well, some think it is. So this is the movie that everybody's going to watch and has watched and watches every year. And I'm hoping that I don't, give a negative about this film because it's marvelous and wonderful and good and it's great and I love it. But this is from Frank Capra. Now I have to tell you about the background to this movie. Frank Capra was one of the 5 photographers that the government, the U.S. government actually asked to go into World War II and film what was going on during World War II. Frank Capra was one of those guys. So by the way, if you subscribe to Netflix, you can watch this. It's called 5 Came Back, and it talks about these 5 filmmakers, Capra being one. This movie, made in 1946, as I recall, this movie was Capra's first film upon his return from World War II. And how he thought about life after seeing what he saw during World War II, that's why you're seeing this in A Wonderful Life. Understand that everything comes within a cultural context, and for Frank Capra, this is the film that came out of it, the cultural context of seeing all of the awfulness of World War II. So keep that in mind as you're considering this and watching this film, and maybe even do a little bit of study on Capra and watch that documentary series 5 Came Back. Well, I mentioned Scrooge. Our family watched this on Friday night, actually, the old version, black and white, 1951. Alistair Sim, who better except George C. Scott? So, what's the idea here? May we find ourselves at the end of the tale in the lives of Nicholas Van Orton, remember the game, and Ebenezer Scrooge, and may we thank Christ that we have been even given the opportunity. So, the whole idea of being grateful and thankful for everything that we have certainly comes through in Charles Dickens' famous Christmas Carol, one that we ought to consider. Thanksgiving in this life begins by looking up, changing within, and giving out. And so Thanksgiving, this weekend that we are celebrating, begins by being thankful for what we have, not for what we wish we had, because we have so much, and so much has been given to us, as I've indicated, from 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and the great indescribable gift of Jesus. As always, some questions. How can we express our gratitude? Service, lavish praise, every good work. All of these ideas come out of Scripture. How much should we give? According to 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, go back, by the way, and read those first 5 verses of chapter 8. And basically, Paul is saying to the very rich Corinthian church, he's saying to them, look, these people over here who are really poor, oh, by the way, look how much they've given, which is basically, he's trying to shame them into understanding their responsibility here. How much should we give? Chapter 9 says it should be superfluous. It should be excessive, over the top kind of giving. Number 3, how do we take communion with gratitude? Remember Eucharist. So when you take communion, when we are before the Lord's Supper, it is an issue of gratitude, one that we give thanks for. And number 4, how should we sing with gratitude, with confession, with doxology? Sometimes as I'm writing to people or giving thanks for something, I'll just end by saying doxology, because that gives glory to the one that glory should be given to. And then number 5, how should my emotion change toward gratitude? And it could be the begging for forgiveness. It could be the idea of seeing somebody else beg and being able to complete and fulfill whatever it is, whatever need they might have. And then, of course, to do this also with hilarity, which is one of those words that we've noticed quickly here in this passage. And this idea that we ought to do it with goodness, with levity, with great appreciation, but also with a smile on our face to give to others. So ends the lesson for today. An idea that, of course, not just issues an appropriation for work, being grateful for the work that we have, but also the idea of being grateful for everything, and specifically for who God is. Next week, I'll be teaching on being out of work. So one of the things I think that's really important is that not everybody has a job, and sometimes people have their jobs taken from them. People don't like to talk about getting laid off or getting fired anymore. They like to talk about transition. I'm in transition. So we'll be talking about transitions this next week in our teaching next Sunday. I'll see you then.